Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. The coroner says Gabby Petito died of manual strangulation and throttling.
When somebody in forensics says throttling, this is what they mean.
Ahead, a breakdown of what the coroner did and why. And could the death penalty be back on the table for the 2013 Boston bomber?
When was the last time there was an execution in Massachusetts?
The Supreme Court takes up the case. Plus, the fate of Mark Gooch is sealed. Hear the jury's verdict in the Mennonite murder trial. And later,
I believe Mr. Arbery's decision was to just try to get away. When he felt like he could not escape, he chose to fight.
I'll look back at the Ahmaud Arbery case as we prepare for next week's jury selection. Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Buckmeyer along with Terry Austin. Guilty. That's the verdict for United States Airman Mark Gooch, convicted in the murder of a Mennonite schoolteacher. But first, the coroner says Gabby Petito died by strangulation, but wouldn't say more when it came to naming the suspect in her death. Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy spoke with forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan about the cause of death and how Petito's autopsy was conducted.
Brian, the cause of death came weeks after the coroner said that Gabby Petito's death was a homicide. He also referenced during his press conference domestic violence, but didn't mention Brian Laundrie by name.
The cause, death by strangulation, and manner is homicide.
That finding in Gabby Petito's death answered questions but raised others. Dr. Brent Blue said Petito's death occurred 3 to 4 weeks before her body was found in the Bridger-Teton National Forest on September 19th. That's consistent with Petito's van being spotted by the Bethune family's camera in the dispersed camping area on August 27th. Blue's office also released a document stating Petito died from manual strangulation/throttling.
Throttling is generally associated with the use of two hands, and you form a U like this.
Joseph Scott Morgan is a forensic death investigator and teaches forensics.
I hate to say it, there's no other way to say it other than choking the life out of someone.
When examining Petito's remains, Dr. Blue said forensic anthropologists were consulted and a full-body CT scan was performed that produces images inside the body.
I don't know that the value of that CAT scan can be estimated. And let me tell you why. Bodies that are decomposed are so fragile. You go from a two-dimensional world to a three-dimensional world. So you now can appreciate depth and orientation relative to injury.
Dr. Blue didn't elaborate, but said DNA was taken from Petito's body.
One of the things they're going to be looking at are the fingernails. They did nail clippings and nail scrapings, and that's gone to the trace evidence section at the crime lab.
Dr. Blue was asked about Petito's fiance, named a person of interest in Petito's death and disappearance, but right now he's only facing a federal charge, accused of using her debit card without permission.
Who committed the homicide is up to law enforcement.
Now, Dr. Blue said determining the cause of death required some investigation. It wasn't obvious. And Brian Laundrie's attorney released a statement calling the death of Gabby Petito at such a young age a tragedy, but he went on to say that Brian Laundrie is simply a person of interest in her death at this point in time. Gabby Petito's family, meanwhile, is not commenting, but her mother told a news station in Florida that the words of the Laundrie family attorney, Steve Bertolino, are, quote, garbage. Brian?
Thanks, Anjanette. Great interview with Joseph Scott Morgan, as always. He breaks down more of Gabby Petito's case and others on his new podcast, Body Bags. Make sure to check it out. Joining us today is criminal defense attorney Julie Rendelman and Terry Austin. Julie, everyone is speculating after yesterday's presser. As a former homicide prosecutor, what can and can't we speculate about the death of Gabby Petito?
I think it's inevitable that we're all going to be speculating. I mean, that's kind of the job for all of us. And I think one of the interesting things, as you heard, is that there was a reporter that asked the forensic pathologist, well, is Brian Laundrie, do you believe he's responsible? His job is not to determine if Brian Laundrie is responsible for anything. His job is to determine the cause of death. So we know now that the cause of death was strangulation. I'll be honest, some of the things that we're speculating about that I think we're getting more than just speculating, I think we're getting closer and closer to the truth is the belief that, you know, these type of crimes happen with intimate partners. They happen with someone that you've had domestic violence with in the past. They happen with someone who potentially flees after they believe they're going to be caught. And so these things are all leading us closer and closer to potentially Brian Laundrie being the person responsible. Again, time will tell.
Terry, the medical examiner's presser left us at times with more questions than answers. Why couldn't he tell us more?
Brian, under Title VII of the Wyoming statutes, the coroner is not allowed to say more. Basically, he writes what's called a verdict, and he makes a written docket, and he can only talk about the name, the cause and manner of death, the age, and the date of the death. Other than that, he has to keep most of that information confidential. And he said that during the presser when the reporters were asking multiple questions. He said, by law, I cannot tell you more. You have to go to the FBI or other authorities.
Makes sense. Anjet, how common is it that a CT scan is used at an autopsy?
You know, it's not that common in the United States, although it is done. It's more commonly done during autopsies in parts of Europe, Australia, and Japan. It is something that is used in some parts of the country where I live. I know the coroner has been looking to use that as an additional tool and not necessarily replacing a traditional autopsy. X-ray machines, however, have been used for quite some time during autopsies. So it's interesting they chose to do that in this case.
Absolutely. We'll give you more updates on the Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie case as they come in. Thank you, everyone. On to other top legal news. Rapper TYGA was arrested in a felony domestic violence investigation. The 31-year-old, whose legal name is Michael Stevenson, was booked for an incident on Tuesday in Los Angeles. The arrest comes after TYGA's girlfriend, Cameron Swanson, posted photos online showing her with a black eye. In an Instagram story, Swanson said, quote, "I've been emotionally, mentally, and physically abused, and I'm not hiding it." TYGA was released from custody after posting a $50,000 bond. And in New York, a woman is charged with the murder of her boyfriend's son after allegedly starving him to death. LETICIA Bravo was the primary caretaker of 7-year-old Peter Kwakwas, who she allegedly locked in a bedroom at her apartment 6 days out of the week. Back in February, Kwakwas' father brought him to the hospital after he was found unresponsive. He was dead before he reached the emergency room, weighing only 37 pounds. Peter had reportedly not been to virtual school since January. Bravo was charged on Friday with second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The 39-year-old faces 25 years to life in prison. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, the jury reaches its verdict in the Mennonite murder trial. But first, could the Boston bomber again be sentenced to death? We'll take you inside the Supreme Court oral arguments as the government pushes for the death penalty to be reinstated.
Hi, this is Dan Abrams with exciting news for all of our Law and Crime followers on YouTube. You can now get the live Law and Crime Network with YouTubeTV for all of your daily live trial coverage, legal news, expert analysis, and original true crime programs. Subscribe to YouTubeTV today and then locate Law and Crime in the channel guide. And for only $1.99 a month, you can add the network to your bundle. Watch Law and Crime every day with YouTubeTV. We put you in the jury box.
Welcome back to Law and Crime Daily. The Supreme Court of the United States will soon decide whether the death penalty is back on the table for the man convicted in the Boston bombings. In 2013, Jahar Tsarnaev and brother Tamerlan set off 2 bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon in the name of jihad. 3 people were killed, including an 8-year-old, and hundreds of others were wounded. After that, the brothers led officials on a manhunt, ending with Tamerlan dead in a police shootout after Jahar ran him over with a vehicle. Jahar was later arrested after hiding out in a nearby boat. Jahar was convicted in 2015 on 30 counts with a recommended death penalty for 6. But in July 2020, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit erased the capital sentence. The Biden administration pled its case to the justices on Wednesday, asking to reverse the decision to vacate Jahar's death penalty. They argued previous defenses that Jahar was acting to please his older brother were inaccurate, saying he would have committed the crimes even without Tamerlan.
There was no evidence that Tamerlan physically intimidated respondent into doing anything. It was in fact physically separate when he planted his bomb. And as for the influence evidence, as I've just said, I think the jury is much more likely to have found this weighed against respondent, not as a mitigating factor in his favor. And let's bear in mind that this is a jury who heard evidence about the boat manifesto that respondent wrote after he ran over Tamerlan, in which he justified his actions on the basis of jihad and showed how proud he was of them. And that's after he needn't worry about Tamerlan at all. In fact, he thought he was dying.
Let's bring back criminal defense attorney Julie Rendelman and Terry Austin to see how they think SCOTUS will rule. Terry, both former President Trump and President Biden asked the Supreme Court to reinstate the death penalty. Does that create any pressure on the justices? And what do you think they'll decide?
I don't think it should create pressure, although it might. It shouldn't be decided by the political viewpoints of any president or any legislator authority other than the fact that it is judicial president or the fact that there is some sort of U.S. constitutional issue. Here, the constitutional issue is the fact that the trial court did not allow questions to the jury to determine whether or not they might have some bias if they knew about the case. So that's the constitutional question here. And I think that the justices took the case, and it's an indication that they might just reinstate the death penalty here, because otherwise they could have just let the case go back to the trial court to redetermine that issue as far as the sentence was concerned. So we might see some change.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, Terry. Julie, do you agree? And where do you think each judge will fall on this issue?
It's certainly strange when you have Biden and Trump administrations both agreeing with reinstating. So that can be a bit confusing. But at the end of the day, do I think that's going to have an influence? No, I think, look, it does usually divide. And in this case, it seems to be dividing by party lines in terms of at least the political views. The conservatives, Gorsuch, Alito, seem to be, at least if it's a reflection of the questions they are asking, seem to be leaning towards reinstating, where you have Kagan, certainly as the leader of some of the more liberal Supreme Court justices, leaning away from it. At the end of the day, though, the Supreme Court is mostly conservative, and it may very well go in their favor in this case.
Absolutely, I agree there. Thank you. And the federal judge in the Elizabeth Holmes fraud trial says questionnaires filled out by jurors could be released to the public as former grocery store and pharmacy leaders detail the relationship with Theranos. This week in the federal trial, former Safeway CEO Steve Byrd took the stand, recalling a partnership the grocery store chain shared with Theranos. The company's plan to roll out Theranos' blood testing devices in more than 900 stores across 22 states. But the rollout never happened. Former Walgreens CFO Wade McAlon testified to viewing a Theranos presentation that boasted 95% of the blood tests could be done on the Theranos Edison device. It would upload results to the cloud with real-time results, but he later called the startup, quote, disruptive technology. Meanwhile, Judge Edward Davila told jurors the answers to their once confidential questionnaires may be released to the public. He specified jurors will be able to review their answers before this and meet with him and attorneys one-on-one. Tuesday marked the start of week 6 in the federal trial against a former billionaire. Elizabeth Holmes faces 12 counts of fraud in relation to the now-defunct Theranos. Holmes claimed the company would revolutionize blood testing, but later tests found many issues with the devices. And nearly 2 decades after the assassination of an assistant U.S. attorney, the DOJ ups the reward money to $2.5 million. Thomas Wales was shot in the back of the neck in October 2001 in a Seattle home. He is now known as the only federal prosecutor in history to be a victim of assassination. Officials say the suspect stood in his backyard and fired several shots through the basement window as Wales was on his computer. After that, the shooter ran off. On Monday, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco announced that the Justice Department had increased the reward for information about the killer to $2 million, saying the Department of Justice will, quote, never forget Tom's contributions to the department and cause of justice, nor will it forget the tragedy of his death. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, looking ahead to the trial for the death of Ahmaud Arbery, breaking down the charges that the defendants face. Plus, the jury finds Mark Gooch guilty in the murder and kidnapping of Sasha Krause. What's next for United States Airmen after this? Welcome back. The fate of Mark Gooch is now sealed as a jury finds him guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping in the death of a Mennonite woman, Sasha Krause. On Wednesday, 22-year-old Mark Gooch was convicted of Krause's murder. She was found dead in a forest outside Flagstaff, Arizona in February 2020. Krause was last seen a month before in her village near Farmington, New Mexico. At the time, Gooch was stationed at an Air Force base in Phoenix. But cell phone records show he drove to Krause's village the day she went missing, and his cell phone pinged near the area where her body was later found. Krause's cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma and a gunshot wound to the head. On Friday, the jury began its deliberation after hearing closing arguments from both the defense and prosecution. After 2 days away from the courthouse, the jury reached a verdict Wednesday afternoon. They found Gooch guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The judge also ruled Gooch was guilty of the theft of Krause's head covering and underwear. Gooch now faces life in prison for his crimes. He's being held without bail until a sentence hearing on November 24th. Back to break down the verdict is criminal defense attorney Julie Rendelman and co-host Terry Austin. Terry, do you agree with the verdict? And was today the day you thought we'd get a verdict, or did you think the jury would need more time?
Brian, I definitely agree with this verdict. There's no question that the evidence was overwhelmingly against the defendant and for the prosecution. I think that the jury came back in a reasonable amount of time. I don't think they questioned much of what they heard. I think the only thing they might have been considering is whether or not this expert on the gun was right on the defense side or correct on the prosecution side. But I think all the rest of the evidence, including the cell phone pings on those towers, convinced the jury that it had to be Gooch, and he was the one and the only one who was in the area, who had a motive, and who ultimately killed the victim.
Now, Julie, did you expect a different verdict than this? And what are you expecting come sentencing?
Anyone, who's been following this case, certainly I have, was expecting a very quick conviction. I agree with Terry. I think the only big issue was the ballistics experts. I thought the ballistics expert for the prosecution did a very poor job, and I thought the defense did a fantastic job. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I believe the sentence is going to be life without parole. I think this is death penalty eligible, but they chose not to go that route. And that's what he's going to get. And quite frankly, based on the evidence in this case, that seems to be what he deserves.
All right, we'll see what happens come sentencing. When we come back, the charges that all three defendants face for the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, and hear from the lead investigator what he concluded about the incident in a pretrial hearing. Stay tuned to Law and Crime Daily. Welcome back. We continue to look ahead to the trial for the death of Ahmaud Arbery, where three men stand charged with his murder. Ahmaud Arbery was a 25-year-old unarmed black man who was shot to death in February 2020. Arbery was out for a jog in his Georgia neighborhood when father and son Travis and Gregory McMichaels pulled up in their pickup truck and fired at him. The incident was captured on video by neighbor William Bryan. 3 months later, in May 2020, the father and son were charged with felony murder in connection to the shooting. Upon being arrested, the McMichaels were both denied bond. 2 weeks later, William Bryan and the McMichaels' neighbor was also charged with felony murder and attempted false imprisonment. The arrest warrants state that the neighbor tried to, quote, confine and detain Arbery without legal authority before the jogger was shot. At a preliminary hearing in June 2020, the judge ruled that there was enough probable cause for the murder charges of all three men. This came after hours of testimony from lead investigator who gave his opinion on the self-defense argument.
I don't believe it was self-defense by Mr. McMichael. I believe it was self-defense by Mr. Arbery.
That's why he took the warrants.
Yes, sir. I believe Mr. Arbery was being pursued, and he ran until he couldn't run anymore, and it turned his back to a man with a shotgun, or fight with his bare hands against the man with the shotgun, and he chose to fight. And I believe Mr. Arbery's decision was to just try to get away. And when he felt like he could not escape, he chose to fight.
Julie, malice murder, felony aggravated assault, and unlawful imprisonment. These are the charges that McMichaels and Brian face. How does the prosecution prove these charges?
I think, you know, as a prosecutor, you realize that the easiest charge, and I hate to say easy because nothing's easy, is the felony murder charges when it comes to the false imprisonment, because that is a way to get each of those defendants in an acting in concert capacity without having to prove intent to kill. It's just the intent to do the, you know, basically, you know, by following him in terms of the imprisonment. So I think that, as a prosecutor, I realize is the easiest case. The malice murder is much tougher. It's obviously the easiest it is for Travis McMichael. He's the person that fired the weapon. He fired 3 times. There's no question that when someone fires a weapon, the intent is to do something pretty serious, especially if you're doing it and aiming it directly at a person. So I think that specific charge is going to be much more difficult in terms of proving that with the other 2 defendants.
Absolutely.
And again, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Terry, the preliminary hearing is probably what made the federal hate crime case. How much of the trial will be about those 2 words Travis McMichaels said over Arbery as he died?
Those 2 words are going to be extremely important, Brian. There's no question, and we heard this from the hearing, that as Arbery was dying, Travis McMichael stood over him with his shotgun in his hand and said racial slurs. And there's also evidence that there were racial slurs on the social media of Travis McMichael. And frankly, the prosecution is stating that all 3 defendants have shown racial slurs and have been prejudiced. So I think it's a good hate crime case.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us here at Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.